I love The Force Unleashed. It may not be a flawless masterpiece, but it is definitely my favourite Star Wars game. However, is this purely from nostalgia, or does it hold up 15 years after its release? Also, I will be arguing why Galen Marek is not the most overpowered character in Star Wars Legends, so stay tuned for that. The game opens in the early years of the Galactic Empire's reign, with Darth Vader leading a mission on Kashyyyk to track down an unknown Jedi. Given the impressively large scale of the battle scene in the background, this could easily be part of the same conflict as the one seen in Dark Lord: Rise of Darth Vader, likely on a separate front on Kashyyyk. As an interesting piece of trivia, the novelisation of the game presents this mission through Galen Marek experiencing the prologue during his own mission to the planet, an extended version of the vision of Kento Marek, where he journeys through the vision as Vader. Since this acts as a tutorial, and the fact that you are playing as Darth Vader, the gameplay is fairly easy regardless of difficulty, as a way to ease players into the mechanics, as the Wookiees and even the entry-level boss Kento Marek are pushovers on lower difficulties and for experienced players. The two main differences between Vader in this mission and Starkiller in the rest of the game are that Vader moves slower, and that instead of Force Lightning, for obvious reasons, he has Force Choke as the Y ability. At the end of the mission, as Kento is on his last legs and about to be struck down, his son uses the Force to take Vader's lightsaber, only for Vader to use Force Choke. Having seen the boy's power firsthand, Vader decides to take him on as an apprentice. Transitioning to Starkiller's knighting ceremony, Vader proclaims him to be his apprentice for the first time and sends him on a new mission. On the way, the player is introduced to Proxy, Starkiller's training droid and only friend, and Juno Eclipse, the newest pilot of the Rogue Shadow. The first three missions are based around Starkiller's apprenticeship as he tracks down Jedi. The first is based around him tearing his way through a battle in a TIE fighter construction site, in a battle between Empire and Kota's army. The second is based around scouring through mountains of junk and ship Easter eggs to track down the insane Kazdan Paratus in his own Jedi temple, and the third is to trek through a vibrant jungle and fight Rancors to destroy Shaak Ti, one of the last of the Jedi Council. En route to the first mission, Proxy gives them a dossier of Kota, who was one of the few who actually had enough common sense to consider the issues of using a clone army that came out of nowhere, which explains why he survived Order 66, followed by seeing him in action. Overall, I think the first mission is a great introduction to the combat and gameplay, along with the admittedly basic characters, and I find myself frequently revisiting this mission whenever I replay The Force Unleashed, especially due to how much focus it places on using the physics engine for maximum mayhem. As most clearly demonstrated by Kazdan, one of the best things this game's story does is displaying the various ways that Jedi dealt with the impact of Order 66 and the rise of the Empire at the end of Revenge of the Sith. Kota initially represents those who chose to continue the fight against the Sith, later shown by Cal's state of mind at the start of Jedi Survivor, and after the boss fight represents those who attempted to disconnect themselves from the rest of the galaxy and to give up hope. Shaak Ti and Kento Marek represent the traditional Kenobi Yoda approach of hiding on a backwater planet and attempting to shelter future generations of Jedi, while Kazdan himself represents those who simply couldn't handle the fall of the Jedi and broke. Once these missions are complete, Starkiller is ordered to return to Vader for what he believes is the opportunity to finally take on Palpatine. However, when he gets there, he is literally backstabbed and thrown into space by Vader on Palpatine's orders, either in person or via proxy, only for Starkiller to wake up on an operating table within an Imperial ship, with Vader looking down upon him, simply stating that betraying him was a cover for a new plot against Sidious, one that would require an army of his enemies. With no other option, Starkiller reluctantly agrees.
What is thy bidding, my master?
As a note, there is also a time jump of 6 months between these sequences, so it's not like Marek casually shrugged off the vacuum of space, unlike certain characters in the Disney era of Star Wars. From the Empirical onwards, the primary enemy faction shifts distinctly to the Empire, with a more diverse range of enemy types emerging. In this mission, There are shielded Stormtrooper commanders with clone-style armour markings, active camo Shadow Troopers, lightning-immune Evo Troopers, and in later missions, Jump Troopers and various Royal Guard variants, the rarest being the Shadow Guard. On top of this, the mini-boss of the Imperial is a Purge Trooper. Droid is established as being a Dark Trooper subvariant specifically focused on fighting Jedi, resistant to almost everything except Force Lightning, and are similarly annoying to the Purge Troopers in Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor. Debate in the comments which version is the most annoying. After escaping on the Rogue Shadow, Starkiller and Juno jump to hyperspace and set about building the Rebel Alliance, mainly by rescuing its founding members, while Marek also discovers his Jedi heritage and sees the impact he had on planets such as Felucia and Raxus Prime firsthand. Moving on to Raxus Prime, firstly, the Star Destroyer sequence is a great cutscene, but sucks in terms of gameplay. However, let's backtrack to the rest of the mission first. At the start of the mission, Starkiller is ordered to use Raxus Prime as a way to damage the Empire's image in the eyes of the rebels, by destroying a new Star Destroyer construction facility. Although I dislike the outfits from this mission, I find it interesting that it incorporates various elements recognisable from film outfits. The two most noticeable elements being the rebel pilot's chest piece and the underpart of Vader's helmet, both of which act as a visual display of where Marek stands metaphorically at this point. After fighting through the Imperial presence, he comes across Proxy, who activates programs based on most of the game's previous bosses, and later activates a program based on Darth Maul. In the game, Proxy's motivation is to simply fulfill his programming, and the fight happens before the Star Destroyer sequence, whereas the novelisation has him get taken over by the planet's core, which, aside from referencing why Starkiller can't just get picked up by the Rogue Shadow before the Star Destroyer crashes, I feel is the weaker version. Onto the Star Destroyer feat itself. Once the ore cannon has been disrupted and destroys the facility, a single Star Destroyer plummets to the surface, and at Kota's demand, Starkiller is forced to pull it down. To begin countering those who think that this is an overpowered display of the Force, let me start by mentioning other overpowered Force displays, such as Vitiat's feats in the Old Republic, and the Starkiller clone Star Destroyer feat during Force Unleashed 2. Both of which are other central video game displays, and both of which have greater displays of war power. Beyond that, there were various Force users who have displayed feats that would dwarf this one in terms of precise control or war power, such as the Legends version of Palpatine's Force Storms, and ancient Sith Lords who could manipulate stars, and some of Endgame Luke Skywalker's feats. Secondly, although it comes across in the cutscene, the novelisation specifies it takes all of Marek's strength to do this, and even the game's version of the feat shows that the Star Destroyer is already in freefall towards the planet, and that Marek is barely able to bring it down, and needs to rapidly scramble out of the way once the Star Destroyer crashes. Unlike the trailer version, where he seemingly pulls it down with no effort at all. To round out this section of his overpoweredness, or lack thereof, this feat can simply be viewed as an extrapolation of the do or do not, there is no try, part of Empire Strikes Back. Regarding wider issues of his overpowered nature, his strength in the Force at this point of his life can be explained in two central ways. Number 1. He is the son of 2 Jedi Knights, and, minus a few exceptions such as Theron Shan from SWOTOR, Force sensitivity is often passed down from Jedi parents. 2. He was trained by Darth Vader from the equivalent age of a Jedi youngling. There's a major difference between war power and refined skill in regards to the Force, and that difference is what separates the great Jedi Masters and Sith Lords from those simply perceived as overpowered. To balance out perceptions of overpowered individuals, the majority with greater direct strength in the Force, such as Starkiller, often have less refined control and precision in how they use it. In Starkiller's case, although he's able to proactively use Force powers with little prep time, there are various points where his ability to use them against other trained Force users is inconsistent at best, even against lower level ones such as the Shadow Guard, who I estimate to be on a similar level to the canon version of the Inquisitors. On Corellia, those who have previously been established as having founded the Rebel Alliance, Mon Mothma, Garm Beliblis, Bail Organa, and Leia, the latter through Proxy's hologram, gather to form the Alliance, only to get betrayed as Vader swiftly marches in and takes them all hostage. Like many, I dislike this plot point as it presents the Alliance leaders as less proactive to those without intimate knowledge of the expanded universe, whereas its formation in canon media such as Rebels and Andor will present it as a more drawn-out and natural process. After Vader's second betrayal, Galen chooses to actively turn against him and manages to track him to the still under construction Death Star. Working through the Death Star, the mission requires dodging the super laser at regular intervals, which can also be used to deal with the various stormtroopers encountered along the way. Defeating Vader and then the Emperor back-to-back at the end of the mission is another feat that gets used for arguing why Malak is too overpowered, given how they're meant to be the two most powerful Force users in the Empire at this point in the timeline. However, that does not stop Vader from being the toughest boss in the game, in both the primary and optional sections. And it also demonstrates just how far someone has to go to beat him, with roughly half of Vader's armour being damaged or outright destroyed by the end of the QuickTime event, only for him to keep on going if you choose the dark side ending. On top of that, Starkiller has multiple advantages over him, the first of which being Force Lightning. Meanwhile with Palpatine, the novelisation makes it clear that he threw the fight harder than he did in Revenge of the Sith. Regarding the Vader boss itself, I think that it, along with the one in Force Unleashed 2, have made it somewhat hard for me to approach Vader boss fights in other games and on higher difficulties of these, as whenever I go against Vader in games like Jedi Survivor, I always play overly aggressively. Which never works out because from an in-universe perspective that is the last thing you're supposed to do if you're a Jedi fighting Vader, unless you have specific ways of countering his strengths or ways to easily exploit his weaknesses. The canon ending of The Force Unleashed, prior to the establishment of Legends, is naturally the light side ending, where Malak fights and, temporarily, defeats Palpatine. Since he has no lightsaber in this fight, Palpatine spends most of the fight spamming Force Lightning and occasionally levitating to throw items or call in extra enemies. After defeating Palpatine, Malak intends to go for the finishing blow, but Kota talks him down, to the point where he symbolically deactivates his lightsaber, even though he previously says,
It's a trick! He's stronger than you know!
Which leads to Kota being struck with Force Lightning as the rebels try to leave, and forces Malak to step in the way, and dies in the process as the rest escape. Once again, Malak gets tied too heavily into the foundation of the Rebel Alliance, as Bail and Leia choose his family's crest as the symbol for the rebellion, which is admittedly foreshadowed at the opening of the game with Kento's entrance. In the dark side ending, Starkiller chooses to continue his fight against Vader and defeats him by going for the other way to definitively beat Vader, which is by destroying his armor's control panel. In this instance, by impaling him with both lightsabers. He then returns to confront Palpatine, who has wiped out the rebels, and attempts to finalise Malak's return to the dark side by ordering him to kill Kota. Despite this, Malak attempts to strike down Sidious, only to get a face full of Force Lightning and has the Rogue Shadow dropped on him. The final scene in this ending replicates Vader's reconstruction in Revenge of the Sith, with Starkiller waking up on an operating table similar to Vader's, as he is encased in an ancient set of Sith armour, while being spoken down to by Palpatine. Sam Witwer himself has described the focus on Force abilities in Force Unleashed as making it a ranged game instead of a melee game, in one of the developer live streams on his channel. Link in the video description and pinned comment, with a wide range of force powers available throughout the game, and even more creative ways you can use them. This is a stark difference to the implementation of force abilities in Jedi Fallen Order, which places a greater emphasis on using the lightsaber, and having a much smaller force and combo meter, which doesn't automatically refill. I know there's a reason for Fallen Order to drip feed basic force powers to the player over the course of the game, and it fits well with the story, but I wish they had given immediate access to all powers through New Game Plus, and I still hate how it's the only lightsaber-based game that requires the force meter to dual-wield lightsabers, although that is something the sequel fixed. Getting back to the point, the main drawback of the force abilities is the target system, which decides which object or enemy NPC gets affected by precision-based force powers like Force Lightning or Grip. which especially rears its ugly head while fighting the TIE fighters in the Star Destroyer sequence. There is a way to manually select this, but I find it awkward to use and often forget that it exists. In the first mission, Marek starts with just Force Grip and Force Push, but the player is given a map layout that allows them to make maximum use of these powers throughout with hundreds of objects to throw at enemies. Along with this, the mission replay allows players to return after unlocking and upgrading all abilities. After this point, the player automatically gets a new ability every mission up until Kashyyyk, aside from on the Empirical. Force Lightning on Raxus, Repulse on Felucia, which is super effective against Shaak Ti, Lightsaber Throw on Cloud City, to accompany the Imperial Jump Troopers that are introduced in this mission, and the useless Lightning Shield on Kashyyyk. Force-sensitive bosses are often resistant to telekinetic powers aside from Repulse, which is super effective against Shaak Ti and Darth Maul in particular, and all have greater resistance to telekinetics than Starkiller himself does, which can be viewed as another example of Starkiller being much less overpowered than people think, even though this is mainly for the sake of gameplay balancing. As a result, this game has one of the most direct presentations of force barriers, with ripples in front of the targets when attempting to use powers like push or grip against them, with this ability acting as the explanation for why characters don't constantly ragdoll each other with telekinesis during fight scenes in films. Along with this, the physics engine allows for various fun and unexpected moments. As a result of the emphasis on the Force in this game, it is easy to use it creatively to get through encounters, such as by subverting the force resistance that enemies such as Purge Troopers have, either by throwing environmental objects to flip them over, or trying to get regular enemies controlled by Force Grip to grab hold of a Purge Trooper. Along with changing the layout of the base missions, the Wii version of The Force Unleashed has a handful of missions entirely absent from the Xbox 360 and PS3 versions. The first two of these are based around Vader ordering his apprentice to the Jedi Temple to test himself against the Jedi trial programs, and take place in between the main Jedi hunting missions of the first act. After fighting past the various stormtrooper types guarding the Jedi Temple, Starkiller fights against one of the Sith training modules programmed as a representation of a Jedi trial. The first being against Darth Desolus in the Trial of Skill, and the second being against Darth Phobos in the Trial of Insight. After rescuing Kota, there is the third mission to the Jedi Temple. In this case, there was eventually a DLC for the 360 and PS3 versions that acts as an alternative to this mission story. In the Wii version, Marek comes across a Force vision of Vader fighting his father. The final Wii exclusive mission sees Marek journey to Cloud City on Bespin to rescue another of the Alliance's founders, Gar Beliblis, who only appears in a silent cameo in the Xbox version. However, since I don't have this version, and the Wii missions aren't incorporated into the novelization, likely due to issues of development between the two versions of the game, there is little that sticks out in my mind about them. Although much simpler and lower in quality due to how little time it had before release, there were still things to enjoy about The Force Unleashed 2. Witwer gives a good performance as always, and the gameplay is decent enough for times of casual fun. On the other hand, the skill and level up progression is completely stripped back, and the story is very subpar, but that is somewhat to be expected given the context surrounding the game's development. And I just accepted it when I played it for the first time from the thought process of more equals better. However, the ending makes no sense out of setting up the third game, which never came, with Vader being captured about 5 minutes before the original trilogy starts. Meanwhile, the dark side ending feels like a deus ex machina for Vader's survival, and makes me question why the evil clone didn't intervene while Vader was being captured in the light side ending, along with what happened to him afterwards. Although he may have also been planned to have a major role in Force Unleashed 3, especially as content such as the game's databank, a set of webcomic cinematics, and even the novelization of the game confirm that he does exist outside of that ending. For some reason, I also find it weird that the costume from all of the trailers is never used once in the story, even though it exists as a wearable costume. Also on a personal note, I prefer it over the hero's armour that Starkiller wears from the Salvation onwards. To put it bluntly, if you want to experience the sequel story, just read or listen to the novelization. The one DLC that fits within the main events of the game is based around Malak infiltrating the Jedi Temple, presumably at some point after receiving the vision of his father on Kashyyyk, which eventually culminates in his trial of the spirit, represented through a boss fight against a version of himself from the dark side ending, wearing the default version of his Sith Stalker armour, which also includes an annoying implementation of a mind trick ability against the player. Aside from the Jedi Temple DLC, each DLC for both games focuses on the alternative timelines from the dark side endings. In the first game, this comes in the form of Malak being turned into Vader's replacement, now known as Darth, or Lord Starkiller, and going on to be more proactive and effective in the events of the original trilogy than Vader himself was. On Tatooine, he fights his way to Jabba's palace for information regarding the droids he's looking for, only to be dumped in the Rancor pit, with the potential for a film reference depending on how you approach the fight. As he attempts to make his way out, he also comes across Proxy and has to fight Boba Fett. The final boss of the mission is Kenobi, somewhat fitting given how often Starkiller fought against that program through Proxy, and the ways Proxy's Kenobi hologram was used in the main story. The second phase of the boss fight sees Kenobi's Force Ghost attempt to stop Starkiller, one of the only two times where Force Spirits have been seen in direct combat in gameplay, the other being a dark side option to fight a Junta Pull in KOTOR 1. Despite this, I feel this part of the fight could have been more unique, such as through Kenobi's second stage only being able to use the Force against Starkiller, rather than having a Force Ghost lightsaber. However, despite being able to destroy the Force Ghost, Starkiller is still unable to stop the Falcon from escaping, and the rest of A New Hope presumably plays out in a similar way. On Hoth, he once again takes a more proactive approach to the events of the films by journeying through Echo Base personally as the AT-ATs advance, this time fighting against Luke Skywalker multiple times, ending with Fallen Luke, eventually corrupting him fully and taking him on as a new apprentice. In the Force Unleashed 2's DLC, the Dark Apprentice, Vader's successful Malak clone, is ordered by Vader to protect the second Death Star's shields generator on Endor, going about it in a similar way to Malak's orders in the TIE Fighter facility mission of the first game, until he comes across the original trilogy characters that the first game hadn't gotten around to including, starting off with Chewbacca and an AT-ST, with backup from Han, who seems to be obsessed with friendly fire. The final boss of this mission is Jedi Knight Leia, who fulfilled Luke's position after he
fell on Hoth,
either in the first battle scene of Empire Strikes Back, or just freezing to death after the incident with the Wampa in the film's opening. After defeating Leia, the final cutscene shows Palpatine watching the space battle before stating his knowledge of Vader's deception and the Dark Apprentice. With Vader's continued weakness to Force Lightning demonstrated, Palpatine orders multiple Star Destroyers to take out the Apprentice, leaving it on the cliffhanger of the clone sensing the incoming ships. Alongside these missions, there are several character packs as DLC for both games, with a combination of Malak costumes and famous characters. So, for example, if you want Maul to fight Oberon one more time, then feel free to do so in the Tatooine DLC, although some outfits can lead to unintentionally ironic moments. Overall, The Force Unleashed still holds up for the most part, and I think that the biggest issues that get generated about it come about from those who don't like the way it portrays the Force, and those who take specific moments out of context. Meanwhile, if the KOTOR remake/remaster opens the gates for more recreations of classic Star Wars games, I would love to see The Force Unleashed receive a remaster that incorporates the best elements from each edition and adds the Wii exclusive missions. If you feel that the Force powers in Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor don't hit right, then give The Force Unleashed a try. Normally, I would say that it's very unlikely that Malak would ever return to canon. However, last year we saw 3 references to The Force Unleashed, so I refuse to believe this is a simple coincidence. At the very least, I hope that we get to see outfits inspired by some of Malak's costumes in some form of Old Republic content. If you've watched this video all the way through, thanks! I know it's much longer than my previous videos, but I'm still trying to branch out to see what works on my channel. If you did enjoy this greater length of video, I have a second Star Wars retrospective planned for release between autumn and the end of the year, and I have similar videos in the near future planned. So feel free to subscribe, and thanks for watching.